Mic check, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, mic check. We're good. All right, let's go ahead and get started. My clock says just about noon. So welcome to our small acreage webinar. Today we're going to be talking about managing pastures before, during, and after drought. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm the small acreage management coordinator for the Front Range in Colorado. And this webinar is made possible by the partnership between Colorado State University Extension and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Small Acreage Management Program. I'd like to direct your attention to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you're new to webinars, this is a place that you can communicate with me. If you have any questions or comments during the presentations, you can enter your comments there and hit the enter key, and I'll be able to see your questions. I'll try to look to see if I can answer your questions along the way, but I might get distracted and have to wait until the end of the presentation. And we should have about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for question and answer. Additionally, there is a box. Let me see if I can get my pointer. And oh, sorry, I just made the box disappear. But there's Ruth, our IT person, is going to bring the box back up, and that has a link to a PDF. Let me drag my, every time, don't touch the pointer. Sorry, everyone. As soon as I touch my pointer, the box disappears. But anyway, this is a link to a PDF of a CSU fact sheet called Managing Pastures Before, During, and After Drought, which will be a really good thing to read after the presentation to really reinforce the things that I talk about today. Additionally, there's a recorded pasture management webinar for small acreage landowners, and that was recorded in 2012 and is listed on the recorded webinars on the small acreage management website. And that's kind of meant for a part 1, and this is kind of like a part 2. If you haven't seen the first one, don't worry about it. You can watch it after this one. And I'll kind of review some of the things that I talked about in that one as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. We'll discuss the drought conditions now and how they have been in the past year. Why is grass affected by drought? Why is grazing affecting our grasses during drought? And what we can expect in the future. And I'll talk a lot about how plant production is affected by grazing and by drought, so that you can better understand the management tips and the management recommendations that we're giving for pasture management before, during, and after drought. So this is a capture of our current drought situation. I got this last Friday, April 23rd, 2013. So you can see that we're pretty much still in a drought, even though we've gotten a lot of spring moisture in the Front Range, and we've gotten a decent amount of snow in the mountains. We're still under drought conditions. So what exactly is a drought? Well, for ranchers, it means too little soil water to meet the needs of our dominant forage species during their growing windows. So during the time that they're trying to grow, they don't have enough water to produce as much as they could. So when we get 75% or less of our average long-term rainfall, we say that we're in a drought, because at that point, the 75% or 80% less moisture, at that point our plants are beginning to reduce in production and are beginning to be impacted by this reduction in water. So here's where we were last year, kind of about, or in the middle of the summer of 2012. You can see we were in a much more, I guess, extreme drought condition. The darker the reds, the more extreme the drought are, and then the lighter yellows are less extreme drought. So drought is pretty much just a part of our climate here in Colorado, and so we need to just accept that and understand that we're always going to have drought every few years, and begin to understand what we can do as grass managers to really long-term manage our grass in a way that will make our grasses less or more resistant to drought. So just to show, just to kind of prove that drought happens a lot, I just went back the past 10 years. Here we are in 2006, and then 2004, we were in a drought. And then next we have in 2003, here we are in a drought, and then in 2002. So really, 5 out of the past 10 years, we've been in a drought situation of some extreme or another. So drought is pretty much, like I said, a normal part of our climate. Pretty much any time somewhere in Colorado is in a drought situation. So how was our grass as far as production last year in 2012 during the drought that we definitely had? The average rainfall was anywhere between 30 and 60% of the long-term average rainfall. And so that meant that because we were getting so little rainfall, obviously our rangeland production was affected. We only got 30 to 50% of our average production. So that means if we're used to getting about 1,000 pounds per acre of pasture production, maybe we only got 300 or 500 of the usual. So we were pretty impacted last year. So what can we expect for this year? Well, even if we get average or good precipitation, there's still going to be a lag in plant production because our plants were so stressed out from the drought last year. They weren't able to build up root reserves, they weren't able to produce many shoots or many leaves, and weren't able to produce seeds. So they're still really stressed out from last year. So even if we get decent amount of precipitation, there's still going to be a lag in production. If we get low amounts of precipitation, we can expect low production again this year, probably maybe even lower than last year, and then maybe even start seeing some plant mortality depending on how heavily grazed our grasses were, before and during the drought. As far as plant death can occur, depending on the severity or the persistence of a drought during the time that the plants are in their growing window, and we'll talk about growing windows, during the time that they really need the water in order to grow. Very young and very old plants are obviously the most vulnerable and the most susceptible to dieback. So what does our drought look like? So the NOAA Climate Prediction Center predicts that even though we're getting a little moisture now, they're still thinking that, for the eastern part of Colorado, we're still going to be in some sort of drought, ongoing drought with maybe a little improvement. And then on the western slope, we're still going to be in a persistent drought, and it might even intensify. And so this is the prediction from now until July 31st of 2013. So unfortunately, it's not looking good. So our pastures are still going to be under some sort of stress without any relief. So now just moving on to the meat of the presentation, I'm going to talk about grasses and how they're affected by the drought, and then we'll look at some pictures and kind of see what we can do, some recommendations that we can do to help our pastures out. So what are some other causes to our grass other than drought? Of course, drought, low water, high heat conditions, of course, are going to stress out our plants. But also grazing is hard on our plants, especially when they're already stressed by drought. Unmanaged grazing is even harder on any grass. There's weed competition. Of course, they're competing for soil moisture, soil nutrients, and sunlight. And then we have disease and insect attack like grasshoppers that can affect production. The depth of soil, so how deep the roots can grow to access water and access nutrients. And then soil nutrients, how much nutrition is available in the soil for the plants to take up. So a lot of these factors aren't really things that we can control. But we can control grazing, and we can control weed pressure. And so those are the two things that I'm going to focus on today. So let's start by thinking about photosynthesis. So all our grass plants reproduce or maintain themselves and grow through the process of photosynthesis. That's how they make food for themselves. So if you can just pretend that this flower is actually a grass plant, then it will make sense for our discussions today. So basically for photosynthesis, you need light energy, you need carbon dioxide, and of course water. And of course water is our limiting factor during our drought. So with lack of moisture, our plant growth is really suppressed, and particularly the root development is very suppressed, and roots, like I've said, are very important because they get water for the plant, they find nutrients for the plant, and they also have sugar reserves that the plant can use whenever the leaves are very dry. So in order to survive in a drought, plants really rely on the few leaves that they have to capture this solar energy and to manufacture sugars through the process of photosynthesis. So the leaf area is very important. So what happens if we allow our animals to graze a lot of this leaf area during the time when the plant's stressed out and there's very limited water? That means that there's less leaves to manufacture these sugars and go through the process of photosynthesis. So the plant is forced to utilize its stored energy to grow replacement leaves, and its stored energy is in the roots of the plant. And so repeated use of this pasture, repeated grazing, can eventually deplete the plant's energy reserves that are in the roots and can result in death, or at least definitely reduce the survival of the plant because there's hardly any leaf area for photosynthesis. So that's the first concept, the importance of photosynthesis and the importance of having lots of leaf area so that photosynthesis can take place when there's water available. So the next point is how important the root system of a plant is. So grasses, about 50 to 80% of the plant of grass plants are actually growing below the ground. So what you see above ground isn't even half the story. Most of it is happening below the ground. And this picture is showing, some healthy grass plants on the left, and then some unhealthy grass plants on the right with some weed pressure in the middle of them. And you can see that the leaf area is directly affecting the amount of roots that are growing. So you can see there's lots of leaf area here for photosynthesis, so there's lots of root production because photosynthesis is allowed to take place. In a normal year, about 30% of each grass plant's root system is replaced. And like we said, roots find water, they store and distribute energy and nutrients, so roots are really important. Let's see, only about 20% of the year's growth will occur using these root reserves, though. So after that, the plant relies on mature leaves to continue functioning. So which grass would you want to have coming into a drought? A nice, healthy grass like this with healthy roots, or an overgrazed grass with not so healthy roots, with not so much root reserves to rely on when the plant can't photosynthesize? Hopefully, ideally, you want a nice healthy plant to go into a drought. So the roots are important, the leaf area is important for photosynthesis. Now let's talk about growing points. So the growing points are the places where the cells divide and produce new growth. And so at the beginning of the season, the growing point starts at the base of the plant here, and here's a diagram of the dormant buds. So that's the dormant bud in the early spring, or when the plant begins to grow. It grows from this dormant bud at the base of the plant, and then as the growing season progresses, the growing point moves up the plant, so it becomes elevated throughout most of its production time, and it becomes elevated. And so why is this growing point important? If we were to graze below the growing point and actually cut off the growing point, then the grass would have to come all the way back to a dormant bud bud to begin growing again. And that takes a lot more root reserves, it takes a lot more photosynthesis, a lot more energy to grow from these dormant buds than if you were to maintain this growing point elevated on the grass by not overgrazing, by not grazing that growing point, and then the growing can continue from this growing point and not have to use any other dormant buds and use extra energy. So in order to maintain this growing point, we say take half, leave half. And that's a general rule that we can use. So basically we need to allow the plant to grow to 8 or 9 inches tall before we even put our animals into pasture, and then remove them when the grasses are 3 to 4 inches tall, and that on most plants will maintain the growing point. Now in that PDF that I had at the beginning for you to download, it lists a whole bunch of different grasses and their minimum plant height. So this is reflecting that different grasses have different growing points or different heights of elevated growing points throughout the season. And so that chart on the PDF will help you understand, if you know what kind of grass you have, it will help you figure out what height you should keep as a minimal height in order to maintain this growing point. Now, the catch is, though, that during drought and the recovery years following drought, you only want to take 20 to 30% and leave the rest. So this theory, take half, leave half, is saying that you need to take, or you can take 50% and that it's okay. But in fact, during drought and right after drought, you only want to take 20 to 30%. So that means you're really only ever allowing the grass to be grazed to 5 or 6 inches tall, and never any lower than that. And what that does is that helps maintain plenty of leaf area for the grass to photosynthesize and produce energy for growth. So there's been a few studies. This one is particularly on prairie sandreed, which is a species of grass. And this study shows that even in normal precipitation years, take half, leave half may not be enough, and we need to reduce the amount of grazing even more, because they've found that when we graze, the amount that we graze this year will affect next year's production. And so if you look on this chart here, this bottom axis is the percent defoliation of prairie sandreed during its active growth window, so during the time that it's actively growing in the summer with in normal precipitation conditions. And so these numbers are representing 20% defoliation, 60%, 80%. And then the other axis is the subsequent year or the following year's herbage production, so the pounds per acre of production, starting at 10, going up to 50. And so what this is saying, so let's look at if we had 50% defoliation, like we're saying, take half, leave half is 50%, taking 50%, and we go up here to this line and then move across, we can see that next year we're only going to have about 35 pounds per acre production. Whereas if we only took maybe 20%, and we move up the line, we can see that we would have, maybe 45 or so pounds per acre of production. So this is just, clearly showing that, that how much we allow our animals to eat this year will affect next year. And it's suggesting that, perhaps we should always be grazing less than 50% and always be shooting for, even in normal years, always be shooting for that 20 to 30% defoliation in order to have sustainable pastures. So I talked about these growth windows. The last chart was saying that the grazing was affecting the production of the grass the following year. The grazing during that growing window or growing time. So our growth habits are really important, and knowing when our growth windows are for the grasses that we have on our pastures is really important. So in general, we know that there are warm season grasses and cool season grasses. The warm season is the red line, and they're probably still dormant right now. They're probably still kind of looking brown in your pastures and maybe looking dead. So they hit their peak production in the real heat of the summer in August. Whereas cool season grasses are already starting to green up now. So if you have a pasture that's green right now, you have cool season grasses. And so they hit their peak production, April, May, and then they go through a semi-dormancy, and then they do a little bit more production growth before the winter in the fall. So that's a generality, and this next slide here shows some more specific examples. Most of these are warm season grasses, except for the needle and thread is cool season. So you can see that although that last chart was very general with one line, there's actually lots of different times that these specific types of species are hitting their peak production. And so the point of this slide is that if you have a diverse mix of grass species in your pasture, then there's more opportunity for forage production during a drought. So, we've gotten rain. If you've gotten rain in April, the needle and thread grass is probably doing really well. And then if we don't get any more rain until August, then probably our blue grama will take off and take advantage of that water. So how do we know that if we have cold season or warm season grasses? How do we know when we can turn our animals in to pasture, or when they're in their growth windows, their peak growth time periods? We can use some monitoring, walking around our pastures daily or weekly, using a ruler to measure the grass, taking notes, and really just walking around and noticing what's going on in your pasture. It's so important. I think I have a slide. Oh, good, I put it in. So the Colorado Forage Guide is a guide that we just finished and published. It's a free downloadable guide that's on the Small Acreage website, and I made these both of these to resources hyperlinked. So if you're watching, you can click on them and it'll link you right to the resource. So the Colorado Forage Guide is a good place if you're wanting to identify your grasses and you're not sure where to start. We have listed most of the pretty common grasses that are seen in Colorado. So you can look at the Colorado Forage Guide for some more help. You can also look at the Piney Butte Seed Guide to Grasses. It's a really good little booklet that you don't have to be very technical to read and to identify grasses. As long as you know what the seed head looks like, that's usually a pretty good way to at least narrow it down to a couple grasses. And then of course you can always go to your local NRCS office or your CSU extension office, bring samples in, or some of the offices can actually go out into the field and do field visits and help you identify grasses and come up with a management plan. So kind of tying this all together, we talked about the importance of leaf area for photosynthesis, the importance of healthy roots, and then the final thing is how important it is for your grass to rest or recover between grazing. So here's 3 different examples. We have a pretty unhealthy plant here. Excuse me, it was continuously grazed. So this is the grazing period and the recovery time. So it was continuously grazed and never allowed any time to recover from grazing. So, and remember, continuous or overgrazing or continuous grazing can occur in 2 different ways. It can occur when you always have your animals on the pasture and you never allow any time for recovery. But then it can also happen when you bring your animals back too soon. So let's say you take them off for 2 days or just a week, and that's not enough time for the grasses to regrow. So that's also considered a continuously grazed system, and you can see the grasses, there's not much area for photosynthesis, and as a result, there's not much root structure. You wouldn't want to go into a drought with this situation. And then the opposite is on this side, where we have a short grazing season and then a long recovery time. And so this is a very intensely managed system. And so the next few slides, I have a series of pictures that are going to represent real life pictures and examples of these three situations. So we have pictures, we'll first see one of a continuously grazed system. So you can look at it and imagine the poor root system below the ground. And then we'll look at a moderately grazed or managed system and how it's affected by drought. And then finally, a really intensely grazed system and how it was affected by drought. So this will these pictures really tie it and bring it all home, I think, or I hope it will. Okay, so our first example, all these pictures are from southeastern Colorado during the drought of 2002. So this first example, this was a continuously grazed pasture before the drought. So before the drought of 2002, we had cattle on there pretty much all the time. Pasture doesn't look very good. And then the cattle were removed during the drought of 2002 and then also during the growing season of 2003. So this picture is the end of the growing season of 2003, so the year after the drought, and it still doesn't look very good. It still hasn't recovered much. And then finally, the end of 2004 growing season, so 2 years after the drought, where they had a decent amount of moisture, still no cattle grazing this year. They actually ended up having high grass mortality, and mostly weeds ended up taking over. So they measured the grass density before and after the drought. And after the drought here in 2004, the grass density was only 10% of its pre-drought density condition. And mostly weeds make up the green that you're seeing. So this pasture did not fare very well and has a long road to recovery because it was continuously grazed from the start. Our next picture here is an example of moderately stocked and moderately grazed conditions. So I don't have a pre-drought picture, but during the drought of 2002, there was still a low number of cattle grazing during the drought of 2002, and you can see that picture on the left. And then by 2004, the end of the growing season, you can see how much this pasture grew back with a little moisture in the growing season of 2004. So it looks a little bit better than the previously continuously grazed situation that we saw. But they measured the grass density here, and the grass density is only 30% of its pre-drought condition. So there were there was some plant death, some grass plant death, and some weeds coming in, and you can see the yellow there is definitely some weeds. So this is a better situation, but not the best. And this is the example of really the best situation where the manager was intensely managing and always having a low stocking rate on the pasture. And again, I don't have a pre-drought picture, but I have after drought, the year after the 2003 growing season, and it looks pretty good compared to the other two. And then finally on the right, the 2004 growing season, it looks really good, and it's come back pretty well. So they did actually have some cattle grazing on this rangeland throughout the drought and throughout the recovery, but the cattle numbers were adjusted based on the grass production, and that's really key. So this manager was moving the animals around. He was monitoring the grass daily so that he could better manage the grass. Now this stand was measured, the density of it was measured before and then after the drought in 2004, and the stand is 80% density of the pre-drought stand. So that's pretty significant, pretty significantly better than the other two examples. So the recovery for this grass was much quicker than the grasses that were grazed much more heavily. So the take-home message is that if pastures are managed well during normal conditions, then the effect of drought will be less severe and the pastures will respond or rebound much quicker. So what can we do now to help us kind of figure out how we're going to manage our grasses from here on out? Well, we can start to monitor our grass conditions. Go out right now and check the soil moisture. You can use the old gardener's trick by using your finger, shoving it in the soil, seeing if there's any moisture. Because if there's moisture, then you know that the grasses will be growing whenever they're ready to grow. Are there any do you see any dead plants in your pasture? Now remember, warm season grasses, if you look today, they're not going to be growing yet, so warm season grasses will still maybe look like they're dead. But this is something to monitor. These are ideas that you need to look for and monitor all throughout the whole summer and into the fall. You can look to see if there's any ground cover, or is the ground exposed to erosion or exposed to moisture loss. So if you look in this picture here, you can see that between the plants there's still plenty of dead plant residue, and that's actually really good. It's going to keep the soil from blowing, from eroding, and it's also going to hold soil moisture in that the plants will be able to utilize. You can check to see if there's any grasshopper pressure, because if there is, then there'll be less, plant production or less available forage for your animals. And then finally, identifying weeds. There will be a lot of, I know for sure that there's a lot of annual weeds growing, taking advantage of these stressed out grass plants. I've seen a lot of kochia, a lot of mustards, and a whole lot of cheatgrass coming in, taking advantage of the stressed out plants from last year. So we can avoid or delay grazing during a drought. So we can watch the status of our preferred forage plants, or the plants that we know our animals prefer the most, and avoid grazing during these peak growing times. So remember, the peak growing times, depending on whether they're cool season or warm season, are going to be cool season now, or warm season in July and August. And so we want to avoid grazing during these times, because then we'll be able to the plants will be able to produce as much as they're going to produce for that year, and then we can begin to graze it off. So for cool seasons, we want to avoid grazing April and May during that window of growth. So right now, not a good idea to be grazing. And then for warm season grasses, August or later. Avoid grazing during that time, during these peak growing times. Excuse me. All right. So if we do want to graze, though, during these peak growing times, and there's no way around it, even though it's not necessarily advisable, we can do it in the best way possible by waiting until the 4 to 5 leaf stage. So that means we wait till we've got 4 or 5 leaves. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we wait till we've got at least 4 to 5 leaves off the stem until we start grazing, and then only graze until we see that the plants are starting to elevate their seed head. And what that'll do is keep the plant in its reproductive state. And then you want to stop grazing until after the grass has gone to seed. But remember, if you do decide to graze, you only still want to allow your animals to take 20% 20 to 30% of the growth, and then take them off the pasture. But the very best thing to do is to allow your pasture to rest from any grazing pressure. Rest equals recovery. So resting our pastures even after a drought is important. So after a full season of rest after a drought is ideal. And in fact, for drought resistance, it's even recommended that we rest one pasture or one paddock per year, even under normal precipitation conditions in order for our grasses to be more drought resistant and be ready, drought resistant and be ready for the next drought to occur. Another important thing is to make sure that you have a comfortably sized sacrifice area, and so then you won't be tempted to put your animals out on pasture, to let them run around and let them play. More often the case with horse owners, because horses are such big animals and they take up so much space and they like to run around and play, that it's very tempting for owners to want to put their horses out in pasture even when the pasture is not ready to be grazed. So having a nice, comfortably sized holding area or sacrifice area is really important so that you won't be tempted. You have plenty of space for your animals to run around in an area that you just know you're not going to expect any grass production. You know that they're just going to probably make it dirt eventually. If you are thinking about reseeding or doing any fertilizing or improvements, I would say definitely wait until after the drought. Because if you spend lots of money and time putting seed in the ground, and then we don't get any moisture, then it will have been pointless and a waste of money. And even and as I said before, young plants are most vulnerable to death during drought. So even if you got some plants in and we got some spring moisture, if we then don't get any moisture throughout this whole growing season, then this little tiny grass seedlings will probably not survive. If you want to know more about renovating and reseeding your pastures, we have a recorded webinar on that, and that'll be listed with the rest of the webinars on the Small Acreage Management website, and that's a good one to kind of go over when you should be reseeding, how you should be doing it, and some lots of different options that you have and considerations that you need to take before you go ahead with it. Another thing I like to point out is that there may be some poisonous plants, after droughts or before, during droughts and after droughts. And of course, there's going to be some weed pressure. So definitely scout your pastures for, potentially toxic plants. This is a picture of woolly loco weed. It's toxic to all animals. And most of the time, animals will avoid grazing it, but if there's nothing else to graze on the pasture, that's when they'll decide to eat it. And then the picture on the right is a Russian thistle, which is an annual weed, turns into a tumbleweed, and you'll probably see some of those this season as well. So let's talk about weed management for a minute. Identifying weeds is really important. So as you're scouting your pastures and you're finding these weeds coming in, identify them is the most important thing, because then you can determine what the best control methods are. There's lots of different control methods or lots of different tools in the toolbox, so to speak. There's preventative, cultural. Cultural is a lot like preventative, where you use cover crops or cropping rotation in order to prevent weeds from coming in. Of course, we all know the chemical control, the herbicides. There's biological control, where you can introduce different types of insects that are introduced on your property and specifically eat particular weeds. Now, if you're interested in biological controls, there's the insectary in Palisade. So Palisade, Colorado has an insectary that you can Google, and they have a website with their contact information and a list of all the different insects or biocontrols that they sell. And they have information on when and how you can introduce them onto your property, just to help you. It's another tool in the toolbox to help you control these nasty weeds. And then finally, mechanical mowing, tilling, and pulling up by hand, digging. So these pictures I'll just go over really quickly. So we've got field bindweed. It's a pretty common weed. It's a perennial, so this is just to point out how important it is to identify your weeds in order to figure out how best to control them. If I didn't know that this was a perennial weed, and that it reproduced by its roots as well as by its seeds. And I went in and tilled this thinking, oh, I'll just till it up and get rid of it. Then I will have actually created probably more of a problem the following year or the next time we get moisture, because all those roots will then reproduce or regenerate and create an even bigger field bindweed problem. So identify your plant. So for field bindweed, good pasture management for all weeds, good pasture management is a good type of weed control. You can use some herbicides during full bloom or in the fall. And then there's also a biological control called the field bindweed gall mite that you can introduce. And then puncture vine or goat head, this is probably all of our least favorite weed. These flowers turn into nasty prickly seeds that you stick to your tires, stick to the bottom of your feet, and you scream when you step on them in your bare feet in your kitchen. So puncture vine is actually an annual, so the only way it reproduces is by the seed. So some ways that you can control it, you can pull them or dig them up, but always make sure that you put them in trash bags and bag them and get them off site. There's pre and post emergent herbicides that you can use, and then there's also a biocontrol weevil that you can introduce on your property. So if you are going to do any sort of chemical control, it might be a good idea to wait until we have some moisture, because most systemic herbicides are less effective when the plant is stressed. So systemic herbicides are herbicides like Roundup. So when the plants are free of stress, the herbicides are absorbed faster and move through the plant system, providing a really efficient kill. But if the plants are under stress, they're not going to be moved through the system and not going to work as effectively. And as always, make sure you read the label so that you can understand more about the herbicide that you're using. And then I always like to point out that it's good to keep records of everything that you do, grazing wise, weed management wise. And this table, I actually wish I would have added one more thing, and that is the height of grass during turn in and the height of grass during turn out, because that's really the most important thing that we're using as a monitoring guide. It doesn't really matter the date or the number of animals or the number of hours. It really matters, is the grass ready to be grazed when you turn them in, and then does the grass need to rest and recover? And so those are all determined by the height of the grass. And so that's a good thing to add to this table. And of course, other things to keep track of are the acres and number of your pastures, your herd size, and the date in and out, the number of hours in and out, and any weather conditions that are notable. So some other drought-induced concerns that I just wanted to touch on really briefly, and the ones in blue are hyperlinked, so if you click on them, they'll take you to a CSU fact sheet, or hopefully they will take you to a fact sheet to learn more. So first, the livestock health, obviously, we need to think about whenever you're in a drought. Dust can cause dry cough, so if you have dry cough issues, talk to your vet for treatment. Make sure your animals have plenty of supplemental feed if there's not that much pasture available for them to eat. And also lots of water. During the heat of the summer, especially during dry drought conditions, animals are going to drink a lot more than their average, gallons per animal that you might find in a book. So the water consumption is going to be higher. Now, Blister Beetle ended up being a little bit of a problem last year in our hay. The Blister Beetle is highly toxic to horses, and it can be found in alfalfa hay. A single feeding of hay with a few blister beetles can be a lethal dose to horses. So talk to your growers and just be aware of the situation. And like I said, if you want to learn more, there's a hyperlink to a CSU fact sheet. Nitrate poisoning may also just be an issue, or at least something you want to consider when you're grazing things like annual weeds like kochia, mustards, thistles, or even field bindweed. These plants, as well as some grains, like sorghum, they tend to accumulate nitrates when they're stressed out. And so the stress of drought can cause them to accumulate nitrates, and then the high nitrates in the feed can actually cause poisoning and maybe even death in your plant. So you just want to be aware of that when you're feeding alternative feeds. And you are able to test your feed for nitrate levels. So that's an option. You can always send a sample in and have it tested, and dilute it if you need to with low nitrate level forages. Next one down the list, prairie dogs. They're moving around for a better forage because they use forage. They eat the forage grasses, and they also use it for protection against predators. So just be aware that they might be moving to new, be on the lookout for new locations to move their towns if the current town that they're in is devastated by the drought. So if you have a nice looking pasture, maybe start scouting for prairie dog holes and try to keep that under control early on. Grasshoppers is the next one. Grasshoppers really are very locational depending on where you are in the state. You may or may not be affected by the grasshoppers. I think the 2013 year for grasshoppers is supposed to be pretty good for us. They're not expecting very much pressure. But there is a control fact sheet on how to control grasshoppers on small acreages, and that's linked. That's hyperlinked. Soil erosion and blowing complaints are really a common part of our Colorado situation, but even more so exacerbated by the drought. So just be aware that there may be a lot of soil erosion happening, and do your part to kind of keep soils covered by some type of mulch or some type of grass. Illegal water use, I just wanted to touch on this really briefly. There's a water law called expansion of use, and this says that even if you have irrigation rights, you can't expand the irrigation to land that doesn't have to land that hasn't been historically irrigated. So if you have any irrigation or any wells that you want to try to use water on an area that you've never actually watered before, just know that that's probably illegal. And if you have any more water-related questions, you can contact the Colorado Division of Water Resources. They're the ones who do the well water permits and handle pretty much all the legalities of water irrigation use in Colorado. And then we already talked about excessive weeds, to just expect that we're going to have weed pressure after a drought because our plants are so stressed out. And then finally, I just have some drought resources. The Colorado CSU Extension Drought website, we started that last year, and it has a tremendous amount of drought information for anyone interested in learning more about drought. It's a great site, and all these are hyperlinked. The CSU Extension Small Acreage Management website, of course, is a good spot. That's where all the webinars are recorded and archived, and lots of good small acreage information there. The National Drought Mitigation Center and the current drought monitor are from the University of Lincoln, Nebraska, and these are great sites that have lots of drought information and grazing management during drought information. And then finally, the USDA drought page. If you're actually a producer where you may be eligible for some USDA programs, they have some drought programs, some drought relief programs that you might be eligible for. So check that page out. And I guess probably just to sum everything up, a very minimal amount of grazing is really the most appropriate thing to do during and after drought in the recovery years. So with that, I think I can take questions. Actually, let's bring up the poll question just to measure how much you learned during this presentation, just to help us understand how important or how successful these webinars are. We like to kind of know how much people have learned. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And I will start answering some of your questions here. So Diane asks, what's the estimate of the duration for the current drought cycle, and what potential impact will global warming have on current drought cycle? Maybe that's not the best question for me because I'm not really a climatologist. The CSU extension has a drought webinar that they put on once a week. Nolan Duskin is a climatologist on campus here, and he would probably be better able to answer that question. Why don't I send out that link to his presentations? Like I said, he does a weekly kind of drought condition webinar. It doesn't usually last very long, but it's kind of an update every week. And so maybe I'll just pass his information on to you guys, just because I don't feel comfortable, really answering this. I mean, of course, global warming is something that we're dealing with, and I think we're probably going to be seeing more drought or more droughts happening more often because of global warming, or droughts being more intense and more devastating because of global warming. Melody asks, I have clover in my pasture. Is that good, bad, indicative of anything? I mean, that's a decent grass to have. Usually clovers need a decent amount of water to grow. So that means you maybe if you're not irrigating, maybe you're in a more wet area, maybe in the foothills or in the mountains, or you have a shallow groundwater that the plants are able to, reach down and get access some of that groundwater. And clover is just fine. It's actually going to add some nitrogen to the soil, available nitrogen for your grasses to use. So I would say it's a fine thing to have. Jim asks, I want to point out to look at your fall rainfall before freeze. When the grass is developing buds for next spring's growth. That is important. Yeah, so he's saying that it's important to look at our fall rainfall to know how much growth we're going to have in the spring, or bud development in the spring, and that's a really good point. Fall moisture is very critical, yes. Also, a soil moisture probe can be purchased online for $24. Thank you very much. And I meant to mention those soil moisture probes, and they're a nice little tool to have and not very expensive. You can probably also get them at like a nursery or any gardening store. It is a 4-foot 3/8 rod with a T-handle on the point at the other end. You push the rod to the ground and you can see how deep the moisture goes down. Thank you very much for those comments, Jim. Pat says, given at least a little rain, not complete drought, I'm wondering what, if any, fertilizer application can help in the fall, early spring, mid-spring. Really for fertilizer, I would definitely recommend doing a soil test first to see if you even need fertilizer. If you have cool season grasses, then there's more of a chance that you could need fertilizer, or introduce grasses rather. There's more of a chance that you could need fertilizer. If you have a native pasture, there's less of a need because our native grasses are used to not having very much nutrients in the soil. So I would say test your soil first. It's not very expensive, usually $20 to $30, and the turnaround is a couple weeks. And then if you do need to fertilize, definitely do it during a time that the grasses, that there's enough moisture that the grasses can utilize it. So, early spring is probably the most ideal time to fertilize. Okay, Diane, can goats be used to control spurge, as they tend to specifically eat spurges over grass? Yes, I think they can. If I recall, spurges are a little bit toxic to some animals, but goats, like like many other things, goats can eat and not be affected. Yes, I think that is true. And they can, especially if maybe you don't even have to train them to eat it, and they already just don't mind eating it, especially when it's young, they'll probably eat it down. I'll hang on for a couple more minutes to see if we have any more questions. And I guess to Diane on your leafy spurge question, there's a fact sheet. I'm not sure if it's a CSU extension fact sheet on leafy spurge or if it's the Department of Colorado Department of Agriculture fact sheet, but one of them has a fact sheet on leafy spurge that talks about all the different control options for it. Okay, Diane asks, how do you get CSU to help you with pasture management plan, and is there a cost? It depends on what county you're in. If you want to just email me and ask me to give you the contact information to whatever county you're in, I can do that, or you can look online. Sometimes there's a fee, sometimes there's not even someone in the office available to do a field visit, but then oftentimes there is. So it really just depends on the office. And also the NRCS offices more likely will have somebody that can actually go out into the field and help you with weed and plant identification and pasture management. If you're, Diane, if you're in the Front Range, kind of anywhere around the Denver area, I'm available to do field visits in most of the Front Range counties for no cost. Oh, we got the leafy spurge fact sheet up. Thank you, Ruth. Our IT person just put up that fact sheet for us for the leafy spurge. For Western Slope info. Oh, that J there is John Rizza. Thank you. He's the small acreage manager on the West Slope, a similar position to mine on the West Slope. So if you're on the West Slope and you need a field visit or help with weed ID or pasture management, there's his email, john.rizza@colorado-state.edu. You can contact him and he'll be able to help you on that side of the mountain. Thanks, John. All right. I'll give you a few more minutes, or a minute, I guess, to see if anyone has any more questions. Doesn't look like anybody's typing. Oh, now someone's typing. Oh, Ruth, can you type in my email address? My email address is jennifer.cook@colorado-state.edu. Do I have any thoughts on adding organic materials this spring? Organic materials, I'm assuming you're talking about compost on the pasture or manure on the pasture, yeah, compost, manure, etc. I think that just goes the same way as any type of fertilizer. If we have moisture, then those nutrients in the organic matter will be able to be leached out into the soil and utilized by the plants. If we don't have any moisture, it's just going to sit there and potentially take a very long time to break down. So, I mean, depending on the reason why you're adding organic materials, you could or you couldn't. I don't know that it would make too much of a difference. Of course, whenever you are adding, manure or any type of organic materials onto your pasture, you never want to add more than probably a maximum of 3 inches depth per year because it just takes so long for it to break down in our dry climate. You could actually end up shading the grass seedlings. All right, well, I will sign off then. I hope everybody is enjoying this moisture that we're getting on the Front Range anyway, or that we're hopefully getting here in the Front Range. And thank you all for tuning in.